People forget that in Germany in 1933, they didn't start with the Holocaust. They started with deporting people.
Right. You're listening to Good Faith Weekly. I'm Mitch Randall.
And I'm Missy Randall.
We're here each week exploring the intersection of faith and culture
We find people who stand up, speak out, and step forward.
for inclusion, freedom, and justice for all.
It's time for Good Faith Weekly.
Brought to you by Good Faith Media. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Missy and I are going to catch up. And then later on the pod, we sat down with one of our favorite political analysts, Matthew Dowd from MSNBC. It's a great conversation about where we are in the country and a hopeful future. So stay tuned. It's going to be a good pod. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I'm well, and you?
I'm hanging in there.
Hanging in there.
I feel like we're about to cross the finish line. We have officially almost made it through the year of January.
Today is the last day of the month.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
We have almost made it.
So, is there a reason you're looking forward to the end of January?
I mean, aside from the obvious sense of the month.
It's been a flurry of activity.
No, it's dark. It's cold. It's been rainy for us. Yeah, so I'm just, the Christmas decorations are gone. There's no more joy. No more peace and goodwill.
Well, aren't you glad you tuned in this week, ladies and gentlemen?
Sentiment is genuinely shared. People are just ready to get done with January. So yeah,
Well-
we've almost made it.
It's January 31st, but guess what? 2 days from now, maybe Punxsutawney Phil will give us some good news.
Hope he does. I'm counting on him.
Indeed, it is February the 2nd, which means Groundhog Day. Growing up, did you get excited about Groundhog Day at all?
Oh. I remember being on the morning news before we, when we would get ready to go to school. My
Right.
would always be like, "Oh, it's Groundhog Day. Saw a shadow or didn't." I mean, you'd usually have a coloring sheet at school or something, but it wasn't until the movie came out that it became kind of like a big thing, and then it just kind of feels like, yeah, we all live in. January does feel a little bit like Groundhog Day, and then I feel like you finally get to the Groundhog Day, and we're all so hopeful.
And then disappointment, right?
I have no idea what.
I started
comes to
kind of
pass.
thinking about, what would it be like if you were able to predict if you were the one coming out of the ground on February 2nd?
Oh, I wouldn't come out.
It would always be 6 more weeks of winter, right?
I wouldn't come out. Like, why? Why would you emerge down there in the perfectly temperate, little dark cozy hole by yourself?
Well, we're going to start out this pod, Missy, I've got some things to share about Groundhog Day.
Really? Wow. Somebody's reaching for content today. This is what happened when nothing catastrophic happens to me the week prior. We get Mitch bringing the content.
Right. So
My
I dove
apologies.
deep into the archives for these facts. But yes, it is Groundhog Day on Sunday, February the 2nd. And I've got some, a few fun facts about Groundhog Day.
Okay.
I would love to share with you if you're interested.
I'm so interested.
The first one is this. Did you know, Missy, that legend has it that Punxsutawney Phil is actually immortal?
Okay.
So, do you know how long a groundhog
Live?
usually lives?
I would guess maybe 4 or 5 years.
6 to 8 years. That's
6 to
not,
8 years.
yeah, not too bad.
Okay.
So, but legend has it he just
Lives on.
continues and lives on. So
Well, we won't look directly at it nor ask how Punxsutawney Phil
we will not.
placed in the hole.
That's exactly right. So that's the first fun fact, which wasn't that fun. But here's the second one. February 2nd isn't just a random date, Missy. Do you know what happens on January 2nd?
No.
It's the cross-quarter day, Missy. Do you know what that means?
No.
That is the day that falls between the winter solstice and the spring equinox, which means it's the perfect day to predict weather.
So we're halfway to spring at that point.
Halfway.
Okay.
Yeah. So
the glass is half empty. Others might say half full.
So those are two fun facts. This is somewhat of a dark fact about
Well, I
Groundhog
think we
Day.
could debate the fun part of the first two facts, but go ahead.
Well, do you know when Groundhog Day started?
No.
1886.
Okay.
So on that first Groundhog Day in 1886, the Groundhog Day celebration was held by the Groundhog Club there in Pennsylvania. And there was something about this that was really disturbing.
Okay.
So Punxsutawney Phil comes out of his hole, predicts the weather. Everybody cheers. Everybody gets sad. And then guess what happened to poor Phil?
Oh, did they cook him up?
They cooked him up.
Oh, see, Phil, this is why you don't emerge from the hole. You stay under the covers. It's terrible.
I told you it was dark.
Was it because he predicted 6 more weeks of winter, or was it just because, hey, it's lunchtime?
It's lunchtime. Had nothing to do.
Did you tell us? I'm sorry, I missed it. Did you tell us? Did he predict that year was going to be 6 more weeks of
That
winter?
is not in my notes.
That's not in your notes?
Yeah, that was irrelevant. And guess what the good boys of the Groundhog Club say the old groundhog tastes like?
Chicken.
Chicken or pork.
Oh, jeez.
So another fun fact, Punxsutawney Phil owes his status to what celebrity?
I mean, it's to the movie?
Yep, absolutely. To Bill Murray.
Bill Murray.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So yeah, you got that one right. Good
I
job.
felt like it must have gone back further than that, but no.
Yep.
It is Bill Murray.
So did you know this little fact about groundhogs?
I feel like I'm living in Groundhog Day right now. I didn't do tell.
Oh my goodness. So how does a groundhog attract a mate?
Oh my word. By asking the mate to come look at his beautiful hole.
No. Oh, a groundhog, believe it or not, can whistle.
Well,
right?
Would you know that now I know the groundhog has a talent I do not have? I cannot whistle. Famously, cannot whistle.
I can't believe you just confessed that.
I know, I cannot whistle. It's not possible.
Come on, try one time for us.
I know, I'm not going to. That doesn't make for good pod fodder.
Oh my gosh. So how accurate do you think the good old Phil is at predicting the weather?
Oh, goodness.
Mhm.
Let's just go with a straight up 50%.
No.
Okay.
Phil has delivered a correct forecast approximately 39% of the time.
I mean, he sounds like he'd be great at baseball. Because I hear you can pretty much fail at your batting average and still be good, right?
That's right. No, you know what's funny?
Hmm.
It's 2% higher than the national average.
The national average of what?
Predicting the weather, I guess. I don't know.
Oh, that's kind of funny.
Over that same time period. Back then, they didn't have the instruments that they do today.
That's
Yep. So, did you know that Groundhog Day was almost Bear or Badger Day?
No, I didn't know that.
So, this legend that we practiced today on February 2nd, actually, there was taken from medieval cults who, Missy, would go into a bear cave and wait for the bear to wake up and find out if it was going to be when spring and winter, if winter was going to be over when spring began. That's how this began.
So they thought it was a good idea to stand outside of the bear
Oh,
cave.
no. They went inside the bear cave.
Oh, inside the bear cave at the end of hibernation.
Yes.
Oh, my word.
I know, right?
Genius. All right. I'm going to cut you off.
Okay. So, yeah, there's all kinds of other facts.
Because, yeah,
Let's keep going.
We don't need any more. Although I did, while I was sitting here being riveted by your fun fact, do a quick Google myself. And I, from the official groundhog.org site, have one more to share with you.
Okay, please share.
Did you know that during Prohibition, Phil threatened to impose 60 weeks of winter on the community if he wasn't allowed a drink?
That is fantastic.
That's on the official groundhog.org site. So there you have
Give
it.
Phil a drink, man.
Which I think I would insist on one too if we had to have 60 more weeks of winter.
No kidding. No
Anyways.
kidding.
So as much fun as our conversation about Groundhog Day has been,
Okay.
my apologies to our listeners. We will make it up to you today with our guest.
Indeed we will.
So we are having one of our brilliant friends, Matthew Dowd, on the podcast today to talk about kind of just where we are as a country, what's happened in the last month, and where do we go from here.
Yep. It's a great conversation. So stay tuned. Good Faith Media is the new home of A Sermon for Every Sunday. This free resource offers lectionary-based video sermons by America's best preachers for use in worship, Bible study, small groups, Sunday school classes, or for individual use. All you do is push the button. With A Sermon for Every Sunday, you can be inspired by and learn from some amazing preachers: Otis Moss III, Amy Butler, Brian McLaren, Starlette Thomas, Will Willimon, Michael Curry, and many, many more. Hundreds and hundreds of free sermons are waiting just for you. You can find them at goodfaithmedia.org or asermonforeverysunday.com. Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest with us. Matthew Dowd is one of his generation's most creative analysts, visionaries, and political strategists. He previously worked as chief strategist for the 2004 Bush-Cheney campaign and is currently a contributing analyst for MSNBC and a best-selling author. And as of this week, he is a contributing correspondent to Good Faith Media because we republished an article that he wrote earlier in the week. Matthew, welcome back to Good Faith Weekly.
Great to be with you. Thank you all again for all you do.
All right, Matthew, I have to tell you, I have emerged from my hibernation, my mental hibernation for this conversation. I'm very excited.
She's been under the covers since November.
So, Matthew, before we dive in, I feel like I have to start with the obvious question that everybody's asking everyone. How many days did you make it in dry January?
That's a good question.
I'll take that as
sure. Not as many as I'd like.
Okay, same. We've got an office pool going here. So. All right, well, let's dive into the topic at hand. The last time we talked to you on the podcast, at least, was just after the assassination attempt on Donald Trump's life, which somehow feels like 47 years ago and also yesterday, right? And since then, we've just endured a grueling campaign, and where Trump pulled off, frankly, one of the most remarkable comebacks in history that I know of. So before we discuss where we are and where we're going, I just want, have you been able to make sense of what happened yet?
Well, that's a good question. And I think there's two aspects of that. Is I haven't made sense of the idea that a plurality of the American public put this guy, who's a convicted felon, lacking any moral character, back into office. So I haven't made sense of that part of it, that it just makes me wonder about my assumptions about the country from my lifetime, and where we are and what we are willing to tolerate or not tolerate. The other part that makes sense to me, as you go back and look at it, is I think this race was basically decided once the situation happened with Joe Biden. And on election day, Joe Biden's job approval on election day was 40 or 41% of the vote. What normally happens in that circumstances is his vice president, who's running for it, and this has happened before in our history, gets about what his job approval number is. And the fact that Vice President Harris got 48% of the vote, she's actually overperformed what you would normally expect in an election where you're basically the incumbent is on the ballot by virtue of the vice president. And so once I think Joe Biden had made the initial decision to run, which I believe, and I've said, I think was a mistake. I always thought he should stick with what he said, which is he was going to be a transitional figure and announce in his first year, I'm not going to run, and then let the field open up to whomever wants to run. That would have provided an avenue that would have made it easier for the candidate to separate themselves from Joe Biden and the things people didn't like about him or what was going on at the time. And so I think it was basically an election that was decided because Joe Biden was inherently unpopular on election day. Vice President Harris didn't have enough time to separate herself from it, and she took that baggage into election day. She was able to overcome it, and mainly by virtue of how flawed Donald Trump is. I mean, that's the thing people say is like, wow, Donald Trump won, but he actually underperformed by a large amount that you would normally expect in a situation that he was running in. And the other thing I'll say to people is, it wasn't as if a majority of the country liked Donald Trump, approved of his policies, and wanted him to do all the crazy stuff that he talked about. They actually, when you look at the exit polls, a majority of the people and about 10% of his voters didn't like Donald Trump, didn't trust Donald Trump, and didn't want him to do extreme policies. But they voted for him anyway, that percentage of people. And they voted for him because they were concerned about, ironically today, the price of eggs.
Exactly.
The price of eggs has skyrocketed since Donald Trump has been in office, price of coffee or whatever else of things. And so they were able to, they looked past all of those things that they fully thought about Donald Trump. They didn't like him. As I said, they didn't trust him, but they voted for him because they were just unhappy in their daily life. And that's where the election turned.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, he's the first. Interestingly, there's only been two times in modern political history. There's only been two times in modern political history where a president entered office on his inauguration with a negative job rating. There's only been two times. And it happened in 2017 and it happened in 2025.
Have we sent him a certificate for that yet?
Well, he is a record breaker, no doubt about that.
That's wild. I hadn't heard that.
Well, there's going to be historians talk about this election for many, many years. But here we are, Matthew, and we are now sitting squarely within 2 weeks of a second Trump presidency. And as we all know, there has been a flurry of activity. And we've got some questions about the activity of the last 2 weeks. But in the end of this conversation, we're really hoping to talk about the future and how people of faith can come together and not only counter what we're experiencing, but also think more positively about a better tomorrow. But we'll get to that at the end of this conversation. But first, let's begin with the big lie, because it seems as though everything centers on that big lie. And this creation of distrust, and in developing distrust, and then we go into chaos and all of that. But let's concentrate on the big lie. One of the first acts the new president has issued has been the pardon of the Jan 6 insurrectionists. So, Matthew, let's talk about that for just a second. I don't want to camp out on this, but this is a big deal. This, to me at least, sets the tone for everything else, that not only can he get people to accept the big lie, but then even when he's caught into it, he can fix it.
Yeah, I mean, I did the January 6th, the pardoning of the January 6th and everything that went into that, and everything that, interestingly, if you go back, you go back and just replay all the things Republicans said at the time of that.
Right.
They all said this. We all said that we need to prosecute these people. They all said that they need to be, have accountability. They need to be put in jail. All of that stuff they said, that just switch it, 4 years later, and they're all either silent or they're just saying, "Oh yeah, we need to move past this," whatever that is. And that pardon and Donald Trump's action of pardon, and I think we talked about this a little before. I'm more disturbed by the lack of response from Republican office holders.
Yes.
More than, we know who Donald Trump is and all of the stuff he does, but the idea that he's going to do something as outrageous as that, and it's so undermining law and order in our country, and the ideas of accountability and responsibility, says so much about the time we're in. And I mean, that we could talk about the same is true of like putting Pete Hegseth as the Secretary of Defense. The idea that a majority of Republicans in the Senate put this guy through, who everybody knows, if you gave him truth serum, is incompetent, doesn't have the leadership to run that organization, and lacks any moral character from his own personal life in that. But that's just another example of the Republicans seem to, I don't know anymore what is their standard of behavior or acceptable action, or of not only political leaders but just human beings. And I mean, what's their standard? And it seems to me, as long as you are in their partisan group, there is no standard. There's a standard that applies to other people, immigrants, people of marginalized people and all that. They have standards that the Republicans apply to them. But their own group, as long as you parrot their words, they don't seem a standard. And the idea that people that beat up police officers
Right.
in the midst of insurrection are their sentences are commuted, and they're pardoned is, I think, just one clear example. All of us who warned about the idea of autocracy and what this means prior to the election day, that's what happens in third world countries that we've condemned for 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
I love that line, and I'm going to keep that in my mind. What's the standard?
Yeah.
What is your standard at this point?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really interesting question. So
Because
thank you for that.
his point, I think, is so important for us to realize and analyze and accept, is that the big lie, it's the result of the big lie. It's, maybe not all, Republicans, conservatives believe the actual big lie, but their unwillingness to stand up to it and just kind of let the results of that big lie continue to play out without any type of reaction or oversight or countering that big lie. And I know that's your kind of next question.
Right. So next, let's talk about Trump's firing of the independent inspector generals. So not Inspector Gadget, as I first
No.
read that on the paper.
No, it was not Inspector Gadget, Missy.
But inspector generals. This is part of the problem of why we are here, because of people like me, Mitch. Help us understand what an inspector general does and why is this so problematic?
So, Inspector General, as regards this in the federal government, is, I think there's 12 or 14 of them, and they're in various agencies, and they're supposed to be, it's sort of an outside check and balance on activities and how they function. So, think of it as like an investigatory special prosecutor. It's somebody that sort of takes a look outside the agency at what's going on and say they didn't follow the law here. They had bad accounting principles here, or whatever. They're the investigative, sort of objective investigative arm. It's nonpartisan. It's not a partisan office at all in this. And there's others inspector generals have been fired through a process in our history. I think Barack Obama fired one, but he went through the process that you're supposed to go to, which is you notify, you have 30 days, you do a process, you do all of that in that, because there has been some inspector generals that have sort of gotten off task, as people do, as human beings do, and they have to be held accountable. But it's the objective, it's another example of an objective person that can make sure the cabinet officials and the agencies adhere to the law and ethics. That's what its job is. And Donald Trump does not want that. I mean, Donald Trump does not want anybody other than him to define what is appropriate or not.
And this is a classical tactic of an authoritarian, right?
Yeah, this is just another one of these. Like, that's just another one of these. I think everything he's done, the pardon of criminals, this firing of inspectors general, so him and his cronies can't be held accountable in all this, and then pushing through. I don't think people fully understand pushing through people that are unqualified to see how far he can go as the Secretary of Defense, or I would say RFK as the head of the Health and Human Services. That's all of those tactics, and that's a tactic which was, how far can I get? What can I get away with? And they'll keep pushing and pushing and see what they can get away with until they're held accountable.
Yeah. Well, again, there's been a slew of executive orders and policy changes. One of those, which has been Trump's number one issue from the beginning, and that is immigration. Tom Homan, who is Trump's border czar, is conducting mass raids across the country, arresting and deporting immigrants. It seems as though in a higher level than before, at least in an attempt to cause chaos, cause fear in communities, and it's been successful. They've even issued an order to empower ICE to go into schools and to churches to find immigrants. So, Matthew, why are these strategies on immigration and these tactics detrimental to the overall immigration reform and, in particular, Homeland Security at large?
Again, I always think of those top 10 lists, and it's hard to do exactly where all these actions,
Hmm.
and this is something we could talk about if you want it on this Zoom call when you want, is there's so much stuff
Right.
that you people just like, oh my God, there's so much stuff. What do we
Yep.
do? What do we do? And he just throws so much stuff against the wall that people lose focus on this. I mean, he's not only arrested, quote unquote, and prosecuting undocumented people, he's also arresting people that don't look right.
Right.
Right. They've arrested Native Americans,
In Arizona. Yeah.
yeah, I find quite ironic that a Native American would be arrested.
Yeah. As one, I'm a little concerned about this when I go out walking on the streets.
He's making me do
Well,
everything now, Matthew. He's not leaving the house. He's like, you have to go run the errands. You have to go to the grocery store.
That's right.
I find it ironic too, because if anybody belongs here, I mean, it's them and not the people arresting them,
Right.
came from somewhere else, obviously, in the course of this. I mean, this is just his. I think we talked about this on our earlier time before Election Day. It's the idea that you're trying to convey to people that all of their problems are related to that person or that group, or it's them that are doing this in this. And people lose a sense of logic in this. I mean, if he is actually successful, you talk about a destructive action to our economy. I don't know who's going to rebuild California in the aftermath of the fires.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know who's going to take care of the health care of people in hospitals that are many undocumented folks are doing that work. I don't know who would do all of that. I mean, certainly not the people that are sitting there saying, get rid of them. They don't want to do those jobs,
right?
Obviously, in the course of this. But I think it's we have a long history in our country, but also the world, of pointing at a group and saying they're the problem,
mm-hmm.
When it doesn't have anything to do with it, and then getting people to hate that group, and then being empowered to do something about that group, which every autocracy, again, another step, and fascist movement did that.
Yeah,
they find a group that was the problem, and then people forget that in Germany in 1933. They didn't start with the Holocaust. They started with deporting people.
Right.
That's what they started with.
Yeah. Yeah. And, that's such an interesting point. I remember back in 2017, I was just really aghast at how Trump was able to gain power. And so I did a deep dive into the political power that Hitler gained prior to World War II in Germany. And it was really parallel to what we see in Trump's rise. Dictators they don't usually take power, they're given power, and then they exert that power over everybody else once they obtain it. And that's kind of what we're seeing, with the Trump administration. We're not even close to where, Hitler and Nazi Germany was, but we're on that same track as far as policies are concerned. And the tactics that we see from the Trump administration, which is very frightening for a lot of us who study history, and seeing this being replayed here in the United States of America. So it's really concerning.
To me, this is a moment like, I mean, I'm not equating. I think anytime we bring up the Hitler and all,
right.
Because obviously he did, vastly.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
All this, but there are some things that are important, which is, to me, this is a moment, and we've had this conversation where good people of faith,
mm-hmm.
good people of faith, have to speak out on behalf of their belief system of what they support. And we could have I'd love to have the conversation about what the Episcopal bishop did.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Washington, D.C., which I thought was an incredible moment of time, sort of like Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Germany
mm-hmm.
in the 1930s, and who ended up being killed by the Germans in that time because he spoke up from a place of faith. But all of this is to me, everything that's being done is so counter to the message of the Gospels. How we treat our immigrants, how we treat people that are the poor in our society, or people that are looked at as other in our society. All of those things, I just don't get how you can read the Gospel. I don't get how you can read the gospel and the words of Jesus and support this. I don't get how those two things, I don't get how those two things can be in alignment. I just don't get it. And the idea that they attacked that bishop, Donald Trump, and the supporters of him, many of whom people are church-going people and all that, saying that she was, because she said she asked for mercy.
Right.
She asked for mercy for the marginalized and mercy for people and being compassionate, that calling her radical theology.
Right.
Which I
right. Yeah.
an amazing statement.
Yeah. Yeah. You know what? It's fascinating. And I do want to talk about that because, when I heard Bishop Buddy's sermon at the National Cathedral and what she said, I went back and watched it, read her words, and she was very kind, very generous, very humble in her remarks. And she was simply just basically asking the president to follow the words of Jesus. And I recalled that back in 2017, I was behind a pulpit during the first Trump administration, and I could quote Jesus and get accused of being political by quoting Jesus. Now, they're not wrong, I guess, to some extent, but they categorize it as this radical theology or being political from the pulpit when I quoted Jesus to show mercy and love and grace to people. And that's exactly what Bishop Buddy received when she spoke those words. That was a poignant moment.
Well, and I don't know if you saw some of this, but there was an evangelical leader, supporter of Donald Trump, who posted it very, very disparaging of her, and then called it, she exhibited the sin of empathy. That's what he said.
Oh my gosh.
An evangelical leader accused her of the sin of empathy, which to me is like, wow.
Yeah, right? Oh my gosh.
Where's that listed? Chapter and verse, please, right now.
Yeah.
That's crazy. It reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from the book we published a few years ago called True Colors. And one of the contributors to that, I'm sorry, I'll have to insert her name in the intro, was preaching Jesus radicalized.
Oh, Elizabeth
Lott, thank you. Preaching Jesus radicalized me. And I always think about that when we have these moments in history, when we have these moments in our culture, that to keep that as a reminder that if you're preaching Jesus, that's likely what you're going to be accused of, is being radicalized.
Well, and I think that's where we're going to overcome and get through and reimagine a new America, which is what I think we all have to do, is reimagine a new America. The America that we knew is gone, I think, and you have to reimagine something new. And just look at the history of where you had to reimagine things in the aftermath of something so awful. It's all been led by people of faith.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what happened in South Africa was basically led by people of faith, Desmond Tutu and all of that. What happened in our civil rights movement was led by people of faith. And actually the founding fathers it was all about religious freedom, right? That we're not going to do what they tell us to do. We're not going to practice the way they tell us to practice. We're not going to do what they tell us to do. That's my biggest concern right now, is religious freedom, to be able to say that they want to shut her down for basically quoting Jesus, which is basically, they have an idea of what religion or what they want to define faith in their way, and everyone else is wrong.
Yeah. Well, I got news for you, Matthew. We've been battling this for 50 years now, and what we've discovered about conservative evangelicals is that they've got an issue with Jesus. They like to talk about Jesus, but when you actually talk about what he said and what he did, they're out. They will always gravitate to Paul, and now, more recently, they're gravitating to Old Testament text to justify the actions that they are performing. And so, but when it comes to Jesus, they like what he did on the cross and all of that, but everything else he did while he was alive, they could do without.
All is love one another and love your enemy stuff is.
Yeah, that's weak. I mean, that's weak, Matthew. Come on.
And I like
That's beta male. That's beta.
That's right.
we've talked before about the, WWJD, bracelets of my youth. That what would Jesus do? And I've told Mitch before, I think that's the problem, is that it allows us to insert our ethic into what would he do instead of what did Jesus
Oh, there
do.
you go. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think that's a little bit of a
That's very good.
disconnect.
That's a very good distinction.
It becomes problematic when you're able to insert your own ethic
Yeah.
or lack thereof.
Yeah, exactly.
So one last question about this administration, then we'll get to like the hope,
future.
the hope part, whatever. So we all know it's been chaos, honestly. I mean, and it's hard to know what to pay attention to. So as people of faith, as citizens of this country, like, what would you what do we need to be paying attention to that maybe we haven't already talked about?
Well, the first thing I would say is you don't have to watch it all the time and get yourself all wound up. I turning it off a good bit is a good place to be, and finding a place of peace and resolve in yourself. I hope this was going to come up, and it was something I was thinking about saying at the end, and I said it in this column that I did, is anger serves a purpose to motivate us to action. But once we need to take action, anger is not a good place to act from, right? And I think the more people watch news, the more they get upset, the more angry they get, then the more they turn into a different version of the Trump world, right? They turn into like, they hate us, I hate them, and that, I think, if the competition over who's going to be the most outrageous and who's going to be the most hateful, if that's the competition, we lose that every time to the Trump MAGA world in this, because they're going to always one up it on that, in that realm. And so I would tell people is dial it down on how much you consume of it. And then really, I think this problem is only going to be solved in our neighborhoods and in our families, and the healing that we can do there, and how we can act in accordance. I think Washington, D.C. is not going to lead us ever in this. I think the idea of like, oh, if we could just do X, Y, and Z in Washington, D.C., it'll fix the problem. No, it's not going to.
Right.
This is much more of a spiritual movement that needs to happen throughout the country, started at neighborhood by neighborhood, community by community. And I would just say, dial down the news and find out what you can do to show your heart in your community. Just figure out the 3 things you could do to show your heart in your community, and believe that will ultimately build change.
And that is a great segue into our next conversation. And that is about our reaction to what we're experiencing now, but also looking towards the future and building a better tomorrow. And we've had discussions about this, Matthew. And in your article this week, you talk about Washington, D.C. being the place where deals are made, but real change and real life happens outside the Beltway, in the cities and townships across this country, as you said a moment ago. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the country and those who are deeply concerned about the future of the country. For a time, there was some disengagement. We were part of that disengagement. We turned the news off completely. We were part of that ratings drop on Morning Joe. So sorry we didn't catch you on Morning Joe if you were on there. But yeah, we withdrew a little bit. But now that we're starting to see these things come out day in, day out in the first 2 weeks of the Trump administration, I think there is some re-engagement. But we've been talking about the importance of bringing people together. So talk more about that for us. What do you see, or what do you recommend that we do? You talked a little bit about it in the previous answer, but what kind of future do you see? How are we going to not only counter the MAGA movement, but really put hope in people's heart to think about a better tomorrow?
I would say, and this is something we all have to struggle with and figure out, but we have to stop looking at connection as a tactic and more as a value, right? That we're not connecting in order to accomplish something, a political end, though that a political end may happen. But we look at our connection to one another as a value that we want to instill, even through the disagreements that we have in politics in this. And again, I think, people should call their senators and call their reps when something's going down and they want to say that I don't like this or I like this or whatever. I think that's always important in this. But I think fundamentally, perfect example is these cuts that Donald Trump announced. He's this bald thing about giving money to charities, that he's putting a hold on all of it,
Right.
which includes Meals on Wheels.
Exactly.
Right? And which is in every community in America, right? And many people that are Trump supporters or MAGA are actually drive Meals on Wheels. They do all of that.
Right.
They work at a church. They go and help and I think that's a moment, and those are avenues to basically say, hey, this isn't right. Don't you think this isn't right? And, can't we figure out a way to get through this? You might believe X, Y, and Z, but this kind of thing, don't you agree, is like something that we should be doing as Americans, as people of faith, or whatever it happens to be. And I think there's going to be more and more of those moments where things are going to, cuts in Medicaid are going to affect people that are both Democrats and Republicans. All kinds of bad decisions that are going to be made. And I think we have to just resolve, even though I know many of us at times are just so, appalled by the idea that people would support somebody like this. I think we have to believe, there's, you can look at it from a one avenue, which is, there's good in everybody, but if you're a person of faith or Christian, you always have to look at it as there's Christ within that other person, right? And I think once we do that, we get out of the idea of like, stop. It's not about Donald Trump. It's about us.
Mm-hmm.
It's about us. It's defining who we are and believing again that the healing of the nation begins with the healing of each of our bonds that are broken in every community in America, and to really believe in the power and the necessity of connection.
Yeah, I love that. We just Good Faith Media just attended the memorial service for Reverend Dr. Tony Campolo, who was a prophet of his ages. But one of the consistencies within Dr. Campolo's life was his ability to engage in conversation and relationships with people he was opposed to ideologically and theologically. And to me, that is one thing that we have lost in this country, with this deep partisanship that has infiltrated every part of our lives. How can we get back to having productive conversations, Matthew, to talk to our neighbors and our family members about these important issues without them devolving into a shouting match and throwing potatoes across the table?
Sounds kind of personal to me.
I think it, and I probably sound like a broken record. I think it all starts with, we have to figure out a way to not enter the political conversation at the forefront, but enter it in the back door.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Meet people where we have shared joys and sorrows. Every person you walk across either has gone through a divorce, lost a child, lost a parent, celebrated a wedding, had something that we can share in them, we share with them in that. And seeing, I think what we do is more important than what we say.
Yeah.
I think we always struggle for the right words, when I think we should just be taking the right action.
Mm-hmm.
And the right action, I think, is if there's a neighbor that's a MAGA supporter and they need help cutting their lawn, taking out the garbage, at the store with their groceries, even if they might be wearing a MAGA hat or whatever, just start with the steps and at some point you build a relationship, and at some point you can have a conversation. But I think you have to have an emotional, spiritual connection with somebody before you can convince them of something politically.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the mistake we make, is we start with the political and then hoping the political will lead to a healing of the rift. And I think we have to heal the rift through just decency, and then we can have the political stuff in the aftermath.
Yeah. And so what you're really talking about is that personal relationship, that human interaction with one another, to get to know your neighbor, to love your neighbor as Jesus has instructed us to do. And it seems so much of our debate, so much of our conversation these days happens over electronic communication, primarily social media. And as you said, that is doom scrolling, and so not very productive. So I appreciate the suggestion to have more human interaction in relationships.
I don't because I'm feeling convicted.
I did something. I mean, this is just, you just gotta think.
Mhm.
So I did something the other day. I decided I'm gonna make some, remember those Live Strong bands?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Right. So I was like, I'm just going to make some. And then people that I talk to or connect with outside of here, people at my church. And all I wrote on it was gratitude, grit, and grace.
I
Ah,
love it.
Gratitude, grit, and grace. And, great gratitude for what we all have and all of that. Grit for like approaching the troubles in life and our struggles in life with grit and then grace, how we share grace, what we share, grace shared with us with God, but grace, how we share grace with one another.
mhm.
And it was just, I know it's something tiny. I know it's something, but for me, it's like, okay, I can at least I can have sit there and say, help somebody and say, hey, you want one of these? And it, I think for me, it begins to build a connection
Right.
that that with some hope down the road will become something more.
Yeah. Well, Matthew, you are always an inspiration, always a great analyst, but you inspire us each time we talk to you. And we are hoping along with you for a better tomorrow and preaching a gospel of hope and grace and love. So we commend you for your work. Looking forward to working with you in the future. But before we let you go, Matthew, Missy's got one last question.
A little afraid to ask it because my toes have been stepped on here.
What?
You're stepping on my toes like a preacher, Matthew. So, Matthew, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So, in light of our conversation today and the work that you do, what is your more to tell?
Well, I have two things. One more personal. This is it's going to sound kind of like minor, but it actually is a big thing for me. And the one bigger, which I want to reemphasize, is I understand people's anger, and I get angry
Sure.
and upset and watch all of this. And I think as I said, it can inspire, it can move us to stand up. But once we stand up, we need to act from a place of love. And
Mhm.
once we stand up, we can't carry our anger in connection with other people. It's only if we carry our anger, we're not going to convince anybody, and we'll never heal. And so I would just say, yeah, use your anger to stand up. And once you walk out your front door, use what's in your heart, to solve the problem. So that's the big thing. The other thing is I am adopting a dog as of Monday,
Oh.
a rescue dog. Callie is her name, that I get on Monday. I haven't had a dog in 40 years.
Wow.
40 years. I haven't had a dog. And I did it because a lot of this has to do with this conversation, which is I want to bring another heart into my home, even if it's an animal heart into my home, adopted it from a rescue dog that was abandoned somewhere. And I'm nervous about it, but I'm also excited about it. But it's just my way of like, okay, there's a few things I can do. And that's one of the things I can do. And it'll help me with my own issues. But I also sort of think it's better to have more hearts in your home than less.
Oh, I love that.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Look forward to pictures.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I will. I'd send you all. She's a cutie.
Well, Matthew, thank you again for joining us on Good Faith Weekly this week. You're always a delight to talk to. We learned something. We're inspired by you. And so thank you, my friend. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's always great to be with y'all.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. Missy and I just finished up our conversation with Matthew Dowd.
Yeah, it was great, except that like I said in the interview, I'm just feeling a little convicted.
Now, you said, Matthew stepped on your toes a little bit.
I know. I get enough of that at church. I don't need it here too. But yeah, he said I've got so many little notes scribbled down from great words of wisdom that he had. But I'm particular right now thinking about, he said, oftentimes we struggle for the right words when what we should be doing is taking the right actions. And that's struggling for the right words is something I do a lot. So that just stood out to me in reframing how we're living our lives right now instead of behind a computer screen arguing with somebody you don't know online, which is sometimes very satisfying,
Right.
but what are we doing? And if we're not doing something, then at the end of the day, you're part of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. James said, faith without works is dead. And so this action is so important, not only to our faith, but also to just be a part of community and that connectedness that he talked about.
Right.
So, one of the things that really stood out to me was not something that Matthew said, Missy, but something you said.
Oh.
And it was Matthew even acknowledged, what a great point it was. And that had to do with the WWJD presence.
Yeah. I think we may have touched on this before, but it just, the bracelets, the shirts, all that, it just annoys the crap out of me, because when you're wearing it, you're telling me that you're going to tell me what Jesus would do that I need to be doing.
Right.
But yeah, it's like more of what did he do? And I think that's kind of the lessons that you've taught all along, is let's look at the ethic of Jesus. Let's do our best to not impart our own values and ethics on it. Let's come to him and really glean how he lived his life.
Yeah, I mean, that question and the point that you made, what would Jesus do? Well, the wood allows us, or it opens the door for us to insert ourselves into Jesus' teachings and example that he gave us. But when you really ask the question, what did he do? That is evident because we have that recorded in the Gospels. And I think we should ask all of ourselves that. What are we doing? And, get engaged in our community, taking a stand for, immigrants and people who are feeling ostracized during this 2-week flurry of executive orders. There's a lot of things that we can do. And we can make certain that our friends who are feeling alone, who are feeling isolated, know that we're there and know that we're wanting to be a presence in their life because we love them and we care for them and we see them and we hear them. I think that is something that is extremely important. It follows the life and teachings of Jesus, who traveled across Palestine and was present with people. He was doing things. He was checking on people. He was bringing sight and, healing to people and feeding the hungry and giving hope to those who were on the outskirts of culture. And so that's what we can do at this moment and this time. We can follow what Jesus did.
Right. That was a lovely word, and it just made me have a few words to say. Before I go do action.
Okay, let's hear those words.
I was just thinking, as you're talking about the things, and like Matthew said in the interview, like you can't reconcile what's going on right now with the words of Jesus.
Right.
And I think what's making me so frustrated and so angry is not necessarily, well, it is necessarily what the executive orders and what all the hacks are doing and how that's impacting vulnerable people. It's that they're claiming this in the name of a faith that doesn't say that at all.
It's crazy.
If you're going to be a government that is just terrible to people, you can, not that you should be that,
right,
but do not claim Jesus.
Right.
Do not claim Christian. Do not claim a faith, because I don't know of any faith out there, Christian or otherwise, that supports this kind of action. That's what gets me, is that they have attached themselves to a faith that I carry and does not say that.
Yeah. They have corrupted the teachings of the Bible overall, and they have hijacked, and when I mean hijacked, they've hijacked it, stripped it of all of its truths and replaced it with their cultural truths, and are trying to convince us that this is gospel or this is the Bible.
Or that empathy is a sin.
Oh my gosh. Really? That blew my mind when Matthew told us about that. That was just absolutely crazy. Great conversation with Matthew. Again, thank you so much for the point. That was great. I'm going to be thinking about that for weeks. So, well, Missy, we've come to that time in the pod that we talked about last week.
Uh-huh.
And that time is you get to share your joy.
Oh. I forgot all about this. Dadgummit. Okay, I did say that.
Yes, you did say that.
Okay, crap. I got to think of something if something brought me joy this week. I did tell you guys I was going to make a point to find joy.
Yes, you did.
Okay, I think I've thought of something.
Okay, please tell us.
So,
what brought you joy this week, Missy Randall?
If you listened last week, you know that we had been traveling and had been to, as we do, we live together and travel together. So we'd been side by side,
Yes.
24/7
Yes.
for many days.
Yeah.
We got home last Wednesday, I think it was, and then Thursday you flew out to go somewhere.
I did.
And I stayed home.
Yeah. And
that brought me joy.
oh, I thought, I went to dinner with a friend or went to the park or sat quiet. No, me leaving your presence after the conversation we just had.
I know. I had 3 nights by myself in solitude. I didn't have to speak to anyone.
Well, I am so happy that I provided you so much joy this week.
Lovely. I'm glad you're home, and it was good to see you, but it was also nice to have some alone time. So that brought me joy. So what gives you hope?
What gives me hope? Well, I did fly somewhere this weekend, and I represented Good Faith Media at the memorial service of Tony Campolo, who was a prophet, a priest, and just an incredible human being.
Mm-hmm.
And hearing the stories about Tony and his life and his ministry was not only uplifting, but gave me hope to move forward. And I think if we could have more Tony Campolos in the world, that the world would be more compassionate, would be more empathetic, and would be filled with love and justice more so now than before. So his memorial service, his life, his legacy is giving me hope today.
Excellent. Now we got to get out and do some good in our community.
Absolutely. Well, Missy, we're going to be back next week, and our guest next week is somewhat of a surprise, but we're excited about it.
Yes.
Do you want to tell the audience who it's going to be?
Next week, the infamous Rick Steve is going to be with us. We're very excited. He has a new book out. And so, we're really excited about our conversation. You'll have to be sure and tune in again.
Absolutely. Missy and I will be back next week. Until then, keep living good faith. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.